Hello everyone, welcome to this massive open online course on philosophical foundations of social research. We are in the last week of the lecture we're in the last week of this course. If you slightly recall, in the last lecture, we have started with beginning of the end of the philosophy of social sciences. Today, what we are going to do, in the last lecture, we discussed how philosophy of the social sciences seeks to provide a rational reconstruction of social sciences and the critique of social sciences. They are descriptive and prescriptive or normative in nature, respectively. Then we have tried to locate philosophy of the social sciences in terms of naturalism and the unity of scientific method, critiques of naturalism, methodological individualism versus what do social sciences do, and methodological pluralism. Against these 5 parameters, we have discussed not only philosophy of the social sciences, but a sort of critique of philosophy of the social sciences. Okay. And in this lecture, what we are going to do, we are going to discuss through the works of C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination, through the writings of Quentin Skinner's The Return of Grand Theory in the Human Sciences, okay, through the works of Daniel Bell's The End of Ideology, and so on. We will discuss this, to what extent and in what ways one attempts to interrogate the philosophy of the social sciences, the ideology, the grand theory. Okay? And in this sense, writing almost 60 years back, in 1959, about the state of the human sciences in the English speaking world, the American sociologist Charles Wright Mills, C. Wright Mills, isolated and castigated C. Wright Mills, the sociological imagination. He tried to isolate and castigate 2 major theoretical traditions, which he saw as inimical to the effective development of the sociological imagination. The first was the tendency, one that he associated in particular with the philosophies of Comte, Spencer, Weber and Marx, to manipulate the evidence of history in such a way as to manufacture a transhistorical straitjacket. But the second one that C. Wright Mills did, the other and even the larger impediment to the progress of the human sciences, he labeled grand theory, by which he meant the belief that the primary goal of the social disciplines should be that of seeking to construct a systematic theory of the nature of man and society, nature of individual and society. That is what he discussed in the sociological imagination of 1959. C. Wright Mills was unusual among sociologists of his generation in attacking the pretensions of grand theory in the name of imagination rather than science. But his hostility towards the construction of abstract and normative theories about human nature and conduct was an attitude that C. Wright Mills shared with most of the leading practitioners, not merely of sociology, but of all the human sciences in the English speaking world at that time, in the late 1950s, early 1960s and so on. Many of the same suspicions were echoed, for example, by students of history, political science, economics and so on. It is symptomatic that at the time of which I am trying to locate, that the leading English historian was widely to be Sir Louis Namier. For Namier was not only at his happiest when chronicling the detailed maneuvers of individual political actors, individual political stakeholders at the centers of political power, Napier was also a sarcastic critique of the belief that any general social theories could possibly be relevant to the explanation of political behavior or the processes of social change. We even encounter a similar skepticism among moral and political theorists of the same generation, a skepticism expressed in the form of two related claims that enjoyed widespread support. What are those two claims? One was that, to cite Daniel Bell's The End of Ideology, Bell attempted to formulate, they attempt to formulate general social and or political philosophies thus came to be treated as little better than a confused and old-fashioned failure to keep up with the scientific times. Connected with this was the positive injunction to abandon the study of the grand philosophical systems of the past with their unsatisfactory mixture of descriptive and evaluative elements in order to get on with the truly scientific and purportedly value neutral task of constructing what came to be called empirical theories. We have discussed this. Empirical theories of what? Empirical theories of social behavior and development. The effect of all this was to make it appear that 2 millennia of philosophizing about the social world had suddenly come to an end. That is how we tend to question the ideology, the grand theory, the philosophy of the social sciences and so on. Okay? This drive towards a science of politics and society was in turn encouraged by the view then prevailing as to the proper relationship between philosophy on the one hand and other cultural disciplines on the other. A philosopher was taken to be someone whose basic concern is to explicate general concepts by way of analyzing the meanings of the terms used to express them. One implication of this commitment was that it must simply be a mistake to suppose that the true business of moral, social and political philosophy can never be to provide us with reasoned defenses of particular ideals or practices. Let me give you two important examples. The aim was held to be that of studying not morality itself, but merely language of morals. Perhaps we are not studying morality itself, but the language of morals. One, okay. Secondly, not politics itself, but merely the vocabulary of politics. Two, okay. These are important. With philosophers themselves proclaiming that there was nothing systematic for them to tell us about the substantive moral and political issues of the day, the burgeoning of a purely empirical science of society seemed assured. Further support of such scientific aspirations came from some of the leading philosophical doctrines, even dogmas of the same period, 50s, 60s and so on. Within the philosophy of science, a positivist account of what constitutes an explanation largely held sway. To explain a puzzling set of facts was taken to be a matter of demonstrating that their occurrence can be deduced and hence predicted from a known natural or at least statistical law. We have discussed positivism, we have discussed the central tenets of positivism, methodological monism, inductivism, systematic verifiability, fact value dichotomy, unilinear relationship between observation and theory and so on. We have discussed these things. Okay. And how positivists, who are also called naturalists, we have discussed. The prestige of this analysis not only served to direct social scientists to look for regularities as the only acceptable basis for explaining social phenomena, it also required them to believe that there was no reason in principle why human actions should be viewed and explained in just the same way as natural events. The result was that individual as a subject for science, to cite the title of a well-known essay by A.J. Ayer, came to seem not just possible, but only a respectable goal for the social disciplines. In 1967, Ayer wrote. Okay. Finally, I mean, this is when I say positivists, naturalists explanation, I mean world of explanation. Okay. And finally, the idea of science of society gained specific direction as well as general encouragement from the widespread endorsement of what Barry Burns describes as rationalist assumptions. Burns' rationalist assumptions. Rationalist assumptions about what? Now, Burns' rationalist assumptions about the practice of science itself. Among philosophers of science who adopted a generally rationalist stance, for example, Karl Popper and his numerous disciples probably exercised the most powerful influence upon the conduct of the social disciplines. We have discussed Karl Popper in the 6th week of this course. Popper's most important contribution was to put into currency a particular view of what can properly be said to count as a scientifically respectable belief. A belief is rationally grounded, that Popper maintained, and hence scientifically respectable if and only if it has been submitted to a crucial experiment. Okay? These rationalist assumptions about scientific practices we may take only after conducting crucial experiments. It is very important in research that crucial experiments to do what? Crucial experiments must be designed to falsify our rationalist assumptions, and a belief that is rationally grounded, that Popper maintained and hence scientifically respectable if and only if it has been submitted to a crucial experiment designed to falsify it and has succeeded in passing that test. If a statement or a body of statements in a theory fails the test of falsifiability or proves incapable of submitting to it, we have a clear indication that nonsense is being taught. That is what Popper said. With this suggestion, the social disciplines found themselves provided with a ready and easy way of separating purportedly factual from merely normative or metaphysical assertions, and thereby placing themselves on the straight and narrow path towards becoming genuine sciences. Popper himself urged these distinctions with passionate conviction throughout his polemic on the open society and its enemies. I mean, piecemeal empirical research in the human sciences was alone commended, while Marxism, psychoanalysis, and all forms of utopian social philosophy were together consigned to the dustbin of history. That is how he brought about a critique of Marxism or Freudian psychoanalysis, that the way they claim that they have become grand theories must be rejected. Okay? Especially, I mean, what he did in 1945, the Open Society and its Enemies, Volume 2. Popper. Times have certainly changed. During the past generation, utopian social philosophies have once again been practiced as well as preached. Marxism has revived and flourished in an almost bewildering variety of forms. Freudian psychoanalysis has gained a new theoretical orientation with the work of Lacan and his followers. Habermas, with Jürgen Habermas and other members of the Frankfurt School, have continued to reflect on the parallels between the theories of Marx and Freud. The women's movement has added a whole range of previously neglected insights and arguments. And amidst all this turmoil, the empiricist and positivist citadels of English speaking social philosophy have been threatened and undermined by successive waves of hermeneuticists, structuralists, post empiricists, deconstructionists, and other invading hordes. By now, with the dust of battle subsiding, it seems possible to take stock, and this is what we have tried to do in this in a couple of lectures. I mean today's lecture and this lecture and the following lecture, that we are trying to focus on a number of individual positions. Okay, maybe what we have done earlier, I mean naturalism, critics of naturalism, methodological individualism versus holism, what do social sciences do, then methodological pluralism and so on. What we are trying to do now is that we are trying to focus on a number of individual positions which who have played, we believe, a role of exceptional importance in helping us bring about these changes of theoretical allegiance and also methodological allegiance. But at the same time, we have tried to place them in a wider intellectual context, our aim being to illuminate the more general character of the upheavals and transformations that have served to restructure the human sciences over the over last, I mean 60 years, 50 years or so on. Among these general transformations, okay, now the grand theory is being challenged by scholars turned from feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, Marxism and so on, and even the Frankfurt School theorists, namely Habermas and so on. Among these general transformations, perhaps the most significant has been the widespread reaction against the assumption that the natural sciences offer an adequate or even a relevant model for the practice of the social disciplines. That natural sciences generally offer an adequate model, adequate theoretical and methodological model for social sciences. That perhaps has to be challenged. The clearest reflection of this doubt has been the revival of the suggestion that the explanation of human behavior and explanation of natural events are logically distinct undertakings. That explanation of human behavior, world of understanding, and explanation of natural events, world of explanation, okay, are logically distinct forms of knowledge, distinct undertakings, and thus the positivist contention that all successful explanations must conform to the same deductive model must be fundamentally misconceived. From many different directions, the cry has instead gone up for the development of a hermeneutic approach. We have already discussed this in the 7th week of this course in the context of the controversies between positivism on the one hand and phenomenological sociology or hermeneutics tradition on the other, through three parameters, the parameters of, I mean 3 parameters when I said, I mean natural sciences versus social sciences, secondly objectivity and subjectivity in social sciences, and quantitative and qualitative research traditions. And if you look at this, that when I said from different directions, the cry has instead gone up for the development of a hermeneutic approach to the human sciences, an approach that will do justice to the claim that the explanation of human action must always include and perhaps even take the form of an attempt to recover and interpret the meanings of social actions from the point of view of the agents performing them. And we go back to Weberian meaningful social action. Some recent social theorists have sought to reconcile these two traditions, I mean two worlds, world of explanation, I mean represented by positivists, and the world of understanding represented by phenomenological sociologists. These two worlds, these two traditions of research, very much in the spirit of, I mean, Max Weber, by arguing that a satisfactory theory of social explanation must take into account satisfactory theory of social explanation must take into account both the meanings and causes of social phenomena. But others have rejected the possibility of such an accommodation, reverting instead to the far more radical suggestion. We have discussed this through the works of Dilthey and others, that the suggestion of such early writers as Dilthey and Collingwood, that we should view the task of the historian and the sociologist in purely interpretative terms, because this world of understanding itself involves interpretation. Okay? Whether it is led by a historian or it is led by a sociologist, okay? The world of understanding involves interpretation because it has different meanings, different causes, and so on. One prominent influence on these developments has been exercised by Wittgenstein's later philosophy with anti-positivist insistence that the meaning of an utterance is a matter of its use, and thus that the understanding of any meaningful episode, whether an action or an utterance, always involves us in placing it within its appropriate forms of life. Of even more direct relevance, however, to the practice of human sciences has been the adoption of a similar viewpoint by Gadamer that we have already discussed. The subject of Gadamer is important and Dilthey is also important, but drawing in part on Dilthey, but above all on Heidegger. Gadamer has argued in his major treatise Truth and Method that the one appropriate model to invoke in seeking to understand the social action is that of interpreting a text, a model in which we are not in the least concerned with the search for causes or the framing of laws, but entirely with the circular process of seeking to understand the whole in terms of its parts and its parts in terms of the contribution they make to the meaning of the whole. That is what Gadamer wrote in Truth and Method of 1975. At the same time, however, Gadamer has injected a new element of skepticism into the long-standing debate by emphasizing the limitations of our own horizons, the prejudices and preconceptions we inevitably bring to bear upon the task of understanding another form of life. Gadamer has cast doubt on whether we can ever hope to reach the traditional goal of interpretation, that of grasping an alien action, utterance or text objectively, within quote, objectively in its own terms. The most we can ever hope for, that's what Gadamer concludes, that the least that or the most that we can hope for is a fusion of horizons, a partial rapprochement between our present world, from which we can never hope to detach ourselves, and the different world we are seeking to appraise. From such doubts, from such interrogations and so on, it has proved a short step into the anachronistic conclusion that we ought not to think of interpretation as a method of attaining truths at all, but ought rather, in the words of Paul Feyerabend's title, to be against method. That is what we have, partially we have discussed, against method to outline of an anarchistic theory of knowledge of 1975. Feyerabend has mainly applied his insight into scientific theories, arguing that we ought to remain an unconstrained and imaginative as possible in dreaming up alternatives to existing bodies of alleged knowledge. Even more unsettling, nevertheless, has been the growing refusal, even in the case of literary interpretation, to treat the recovery of an intended meaning as any part of the interpreter's task. Here, the leading iconoclast has been Jacques Derrida. the subject, Derrida is fond of pointing to examples in which, due to the presence of some semantic ambiguity, together with the absence of any context that tells us how to take what has been said, the result is an utterance we cannot hope to interpret with any certainty at all. Then we are becoming more uncertain about the world, precisely because of varying interpretations, varying meanings, varying causes and so on. And then Derrida generalizes this insight to entire texts and Uyghurs, insisting that we never have enough authority or privilege, or we never have adequate authority to privilege any one interpretation over another. The hermeneutic enterprise that Derrida concludes is actually a mistake. What is needed instead is what he calls dissemination, the activity of illustrating with more and more examples ultimate illegibility of texts. Along with these proliferating philosophical doubts about the possibility of modeling the social disciplines on a traditional image of the natural sciences, a series of moral objections have been raised of recent years against the positivist ambition to construct a science of society. One of the first victims of this development proved to be the end of ideology argument, that you will find, for example, Habermas went on to emphasize a deeper level of moral bankruptcy encouraged by this vision of political life. What Habermas did, Habermas was referring to McIntyre and others who quickly pointed out that the thesis itself, the end of ideology thesis itself, amounted to little more than an ideological reading of consensus politics in which silence was taken for agreement. Habermas subsequently went on to emphasize a deeper level of moral bankruptcy encouraged by this vision of political life. As Habermas argued in Legitimation Crisis, to claim that politics is a purely technological affair, and thus that ideology must have come to an end, has the effect of grounding the stability and even the legitimacy of the state on its capacity to maintain a high level of technological success, above all by delivering sustained rate of economic growth. That is what Habermas had to say. The danger that if politics is a matter of technological behavior, then the danger is obvious. In times of economic recession, such states will be unable to call on any wider or more traditional loyalties on the part of their citizens, with the result that economic difficulties will readily and dangerously mutate into crisis of legitimacy. In Legitimation Crisis, that is what Habermas was describing. It is a striking fact that although Habermas presents this diagnosis from a Marxist perspective, a number of political writers from the so-called new right have lately developed a remarkably similar attack on the moral limitations of laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire means non-interventionist state, non-interventionist government, defending a form of conservatism founded not on free markets and the minimalist state, but rather on an almost Hegelian sense that the values of community, loyalty and deference must be prized and cultivated above all. Even more vociferous doubts about the normative presuppositions of positivism have been voiced of recent years by the psychologists to perceive all human behavior in law-like causal terms, as R.D. Laing and his associates have especially protested, presupposes that the question to ask about abnormal behavior must always be what malfunction is promoting it. But this is to overlook the possibility that the behavior in question may be strategic, a way of trying to cope with the world, and this oversight, Laing has argued, has the effect of reducing the agents involved to objects of manipulation when they deserve to be treated as subjects of consciousness. Behind this move towards an existential psychology can be discerned the authority of Sartre, to whom Lang and his followers owe an evident intellectual debt, Jean Paul Sartre. Okay. Among more recent theorists, however, undoubtedly the most influential of those who have come to think in these terms has been Michel Foucault. I mean, when I say Michel Foucault, this subject is very important. I mean, this topic is very important. I mean, for the past 3 to 4 decades, you will find that, I mean, Foucault passed away in 1984. You will find that Foucault devoted himself to compiling historical case studies about the treatment of such issues as madness, sexuality and criminality in our society. His aim being to demonstrate that aims to understand such phenomena have increasingly become associated with techniques of social control. As a philosopher, Michel Foucault's central concern came to that of forging a link between such claims of knowledge on the one hand and the exercise. I mean, one is claims to knowledge on the one hand and the exercise of coercive power on the other. As a moralist, as a moral philosopher, Foucault's aim became that of urging us to break out of the prison we have increasingly built around ourselves in the name of scientific anthropology. He was an almost romantic protest. Foucault's was an almost romantic protest, one with a long pedigree among critics of industrial capitalism against the routines and disciplines of our society, a protest which he combined with a call to resist and destroy the so-called human sciences in the name of our own humanity. These various lines of attack on the very idea of social sciences have in part derived and have drawn great strength from increasing doubts as to whether the sciences themselves are truly capable of living up to their own image as paradigms of the rational pursuit of knowledge. Here the most influential skepticism has been expressed by Thomas Kuhn, that we have discussed in the 6th week of this course. Citing extensive evidence from the history of science, Kuhn has argued in his classic study, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions of 1962, that scientific communities rarely, if ever, espouse a Popperian ideal of seeking counter-examples to existing hypotheses and accepting as knowledge only such propositions as survive such tests. Normal science, as Kuhn calls it, instead proceeds by seeking confirmation of existing theories, theories whose authority is generally invoked to dispose of awkward counterexamples rather than being abandoned in the light of them. Whereas Popper had sought to question the Humean analysis of rational belief, Kuhn's analysis reinstates it. To this account, Kuhn adds that if we wish to explain the acceptance or rejection of particular scientific hypothesis, what we need to invoke are the established customs of science as a profession, not merely the purportedly rational methods of disinterested scientists. In a fascinating parallel with Foucault's thought, the practice of science is thus depicted as a means of controlling what is permitted to count as knowledge. Kuhn's most basic contention is that the reason why the sciences do not and cannot emulate a Popperian account of their practice is that our access to the facts, in the light of which we test our beliefs, is always filtered by what Kuhn has called our existing paradigms or frameworks of understanding. To put the point more starkly, to put it succinctly, there are no facts independent of our theories about them, and in consequence, viewing no one way of viewing, classifying and explaining the world that all rational persons are obliged to accept. Rival theories can of course be compared, but not against an objective scale. In the end, they are simply incommensurable with the result that their exponents may be said, I mean in Kuhn's idealist sounding metaphor, to be living and working in different worlds. Kuhn's attack on standard notions of scientific rationality bears some resemblance to Quine's celebrated onslaught on what he calls the empiricist dogma of supposing there to be a categorical distinction between concepts and facts. That is what Quine said. It is also somewhat reminiscent of Ludwig Wittgenstein's insistence that all our attempts to understand what we call the facts will always be relative to the framework of a particular form of life. Where all these influences have flowed together, as they have, for example, in Richard Rorty's remarkable book Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, the outcome has been nothing less than a disposition to question the place of philosophy as well as the sciences within our culture. If our access to reality is inevitably conditioned by local beliefs about what is to count as knowledge, then the traditional claim of the sciences to be finding out more and more about the world as it really is begins to look questionable or at least unduly simplified. Moreover, if there is no canonical grid of concepts in terms of which the world is best divided up and classified into, then the traditional role of philosophy as the discipline that analyzes such concepts is also thrown into doubt. Epistemology, for instance, the body of knowledge or a theory of knowledge, for instance, conceived in Kantian terms as the study of what can be known with certainty, begins to appear to us as an impossibility. Instead, we appear to be threatened with the spectre of epistemological relativism. Okay. That is what Barnes suggested, David Bloor suggested in Knowledge and Social Imagery. What Bloor wrote, that all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is socially caused, and that is why epistemological relativism assumes greater significance through the works of Barry Barnes and David Bloor. Among those who have argued in this way, the study of history has increasingly proved to be a fertile source of inspiration and evidence. Foucault's writings constantly seek to confront our sense of how the world needs to be seen with the very different record of how it has in fact been seen at different times. Kuhn similarly presents himself as a historian seeking to investigate the actual behavior of scientific communities in such a way as to undermine, by reference to the historical record, some of the a priori, prior to empiricism, prior to experience commitments of contemporary philosophers of science. Partly in consequence of these developments, a number of historians as well as ethnographers have in turn become quite explicit in presenting their own studies as further ammunition in the fight against naive realism and associated normative views about human nature and rationality. Among historians of science, historians of moral and political philosophy, and above all among cultural anthropologists, the study of the alien and the exotic has increasingly been held to take its point from the capacity of other ages and other cultures to offer us counterexamples to some of our most cherished presuppositions and beliefs. By this stage, nevertheless, it may begin to sound paradoxical to speak of these skeptical strands of thoughts as contributions to a return of grand theory, a return of the epistemology in the human sciences. That is what Quentin Skinner wrote in The Return of Grand Theory in the Human Sciences, I think in 1990 or so, 1991. If there is one feature common to all the thinkers that we have discussed till now, it is willingness to emphasize the importance of the local and the contingent, a desire to underline the extent to which our own concepts and attitudes have been shaped by particular historical circumstances, and a correspondingly strong dislike amounting almost to hatred in the case of Wittgenstein of all overarching theories and singular schemes of explanation. With some of the thinkers that with some of the theoretical vantage points that we have tried to reflect upon. This has led implicitly with Foucault, quite explicitly with Feyerabend, to a norm of conceptual relativism so strong as to seem almost self-defeating, and to something like the project of seeking to demolish the claims of theory and method to organize the materials of experience. To describe such skeptics as grand theorists may well sound dangerously like missing the point. To this apparent paradox, however, there are two responses to be made. One is that the joke, so to speak, is on the skeptics themselves, although they have given reasons for repudiating the activity of theorizing. They have of course been engaged in theorizing at the same time, and there is no denying that Foucault has articulated general view about the nature of knowledge that Wittgenstein presents us with an abstract account of meaning and understanding. We have already discussed this meaning and understanding, that Feyerabend has a preferred and almost Popperian method of judging scientific hypothesis, and even that Derrida presupposes the possibility of constructing interpretations when he tells us that our next task should be that of deconstructing them. There can be no doubt nevertheless, there can be no doubt moreover that all these anti-theorists have had a decisive impact on redirecting the efforts of social philosophers in the present generation, if only by exposing the inadequacies of received beliefs. And there is a paradox, in short, in giving a pride of place to the iconoclasts almost in spite of themselves. They have proved to be among the grandest theorists of current practice throughout a wide range of the social disciplines. The second, Quentin Skinner's second and main response is that after surveying the contributions made by these all-purpose subversives, Skinner's story is still only half told. That is what Skinner argues, that we next need to note that during the past 40 years or 50 years or so on, there has also been an unashamed return to the deliberate construction of precisely those grand theories of human nature and conduct which C. Wright Mills and his generation had hoped to outlaw from any central place in the human sciences. That is why you may find that grand theory is coming back now. There is a tendency, we can also interrogate this. Okay? This can be seen most obviously in the case of moral and political philosophy. Here somewhat ironically, the destructive work of the skeptics has served to clear the ground on which the grandest theoretical structures have since been raised. To understand how this has come about, we need only recall the strong emphasis placed by most of the writers we have so far been considering on the idea that concepts are not timeless entities with fixed meanings. Concepts are also dynamic, concepts are not static, because when our real world phenomena undergo changes, concepts are bound to change, okay? But should rather be thought of as weapons. Concepts should be thought of as weapons for Heidegger or as tools for Wittgenstein, the understanding of which is always in part a matter of saying who is wielding them and for what purposes. But if this is granted, then the orthodoxy that Quentin Skinner initially cited, that the task of moral and or political philosophy is to analyze the language of morals and or the vocabulary of politics, is automatically discredited. Then we go back to morality itself, politics itself, and so on. Okay? To cite Foucault's way of putting the objection, there is simply no such changeless grid of concepts and meanings awaiting neutral analysis. The void thus created at the center of analytical, moral and political philosophy has now been filled by a revision two most time honored objectives of these disciplines. What are those two? I mean, one has been a renewed willingness directly to address the most pressing evaluative issues of the day. As a result, evaluation, we must evaluate everything, right. So, as a result, such topics as the justice of war, the social causes of famine, the responsibility of individual for nature, the welfare of animals, the limits of political obligation, the rights of the unborn, of future generations, and above all the tasks, above all the risks of being defended to death. All these and many other, what Skinner, Quentin Skinner in the Return of Grand Theory in the Human Sciences argues, that all these and many other kindred questions of obvious urgency have again become the staples of philosophical debate. But the other and even more startling development has been a return to grand theory in the most traditional and architectonic style, clinical clinical arrangement. The style employed by the great normative system builders of earlier centuries. Moral and political philosophers have ceased to be in the least sigh of telling us their task is that of helping us understand how best to live our lives. Throwing off their purely linguistic preoccupations, they have gone on to receive a heady and a recognizably Platonic view of their discipline as essentially concerned with elucidating the character of the good life and the boundaries of a free and just society. So much high seriousness has this generated indeed, that there are even some signs that the charge of triviality regularly levelled at the subject in its metaethical days may be replaced by a no less justified accusation of undue self-importance. It is of course true that such lofty aspirations had never been completely repudiated, at least in German and hence to some extent in American social philosophy. Marcuse aren't immediately spring to my mind. I mean, a comparable commitment, however, now informs the work of many writers trained in the more rarefied atmosphere of analytical philosophy. The effect has been to initiate an energetic and profound debate between the rival theories of social and political life, each of which has now become highly systematic in structure as well as ambitious in scale. Of these two schools of thought, the one that has enjoyed more prominence in recent years has been based on emphasizing in Kantian when the absolute separateness of persons and individuals and the alleged sanctity of their individual rights. Among legal theorists, Ronald Dworkin in particular has invoked these principles to question the assumptions of legal positivism in his Taking Rights Seriously in 1978. Even more influentially, a number of political theorists have employed a similar approach to challenge the tenets of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, for example, thereby seeking to restore the idea of distributive justice to the center of our political thought. When we talk about distributive justice, we must also talk about cognitive justice. This term cognitive justice was coined by Shiv Vishwanathan. Okay. Then what we are trying to do here, that if we turn to the wider fields of sociology and social philosophy, we find similar signs of a return to grand theory even more in evidence. You may find the works of Skinner, you may find the works of Michael Borrow and others, that the return of grand theory has brought with it many classes of titans. Gadamer has debated with Heidegger, Levi-Strauss with Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Kuhn with Paul Feyerabend, Dworkin with Hart, Nozick with Rawls, Foucault with Derrida, and Jürgen Habermas with almost everyone. For example, Skinner tries to, Quentin Skinner in The Return of Grand Theory in the Human Sciences, tries to look at these debates, and we have not tried here to outline, to smooth out, we have not tried to, in this lecture we have not tried to smooth out these differences in the name of producing a neat account, all I have tried to situate a number of leading figures roughly in their appropriate places in the current intellectual landscape, theoretical constructs and methodological as theoretical constructs and methodological devices. It is obvious, however, that what I have produced, I have tried to convey to you is the merest sketch, and that what is needed if we wish to familiarize ourselves with the somewhat rugged terrain that I have been surveying is a series of more detailed and more expert guides. Okay? Then what we are going to do in the next lecture is that we will discuss further on the account of return of grand theory in the human sciences as a response to beginning of the end of the philosophy of the social sciences. Then what we have discussed today in this lecture, that we have started with C. Wright Mills, the sociological imagination of 1959. I mean, there are two major theoretical traditions which impede the development of sociological imagination according to C. Wright Mills. Okay. Then we have discussed Bell's The End of Ideology, idiom, and science of politics and society. I mean, the relationship between philosophy on the one hand and other cultural disciplines on the other. We do not talk about morality today, but we are merely engaged in the language of morals. We do not talk about politics today, rather we are merely engaged in the vocabulary of politics. Okay. Then we tried to reflect on the distinctions as well as the relationship between the world of explanation and the world of understanding. Then how Quentin Skinner in his The Return of Grand Theory in the Social Sciences tries to reflect on the end of grand theory and in turn return of grand theory in the human sciences. That is what we have discussed, and in the next lecture we are particularly concerned about the return of grand theory in the human sciences. Thank you.